Pods, micro schools, learning neighborhoods. Call them what you want, but tiny schools are changing the way America thinks about education. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. Today we're heading into the classroom, sort of. We're talking about micro schools, sometimes called learning pods. So, Stephen, before we get into all things that are kind of US microschooling and what people are doing differently, what does the homeschooling situation look like in the UK?
It's very similar to the US in that obviously most schools are state schools. They're funded by the state, but we also have private school education as well.
Okay.
We do have church schools that are state schools as well. So we have religious
Nice.
education as part of the state system, which is a bit different. And all the best schools tend to be the church schools, actually. But then people also do have the option to homeschool their children. Now, there's an added wrinkle in that people who homeschool their children, again, are quite passionate about it generally, as the same as you get in America. But in England, we do have a standard set of exams at age 16 and 18. So if you homeschool your kids, you need your kids to take those exams. So you need to be teaching your children towards this common set of exams in a way that's not the same in America, where states have their own curricula. They might not even have curricula. You know, the whole idea of a national curriculum has been very sort of controversial in America. But certainly
Yeah.
in the UK, you need your child to pass their maths GCSE at age 16. Now they have to take that exam somewhere, and so if you homeschool your kids, you have to find a school that will allow you to buy that exam effectively. And you know they're not cheap, so you have to pay to take the exam. But also there's a lot of exams. They're like the science exams, for example, that have practical elements to them. So you have to go somehow. This kid has to go into a laboratory somewhere and carry out an experiment, and it's a pain for the schools. So most
Yeah.
schools don't do it. But they won't take homeschool
Oh,
kids. There's only a handful of schools that will do it. So it's really hard
wow.
for people who homeschool their kids to actually find schools that will take them. And so when I was working in the Department for Education, I was working on exams policy. This was a big issue. So we had a lot of dealings with the lobby to do with homeschooling. And they were saying schools should have to take them in exams. It should be the law that schools cannot say no. And we're like, oh, not really, not going to do that. And so you get those same kind of arguments. But on the other
Yeah.
side, of course, you've got the people saying, well, people who homeschool, often the kids aren't getting a good education. Is that fair? You know, this
Mm-hmm.
idea that parents are always right. So parents always know what's best for their children.
Mm-hmm.
Absolute nonsense. Of course they don't. They don't have all the terrible things that happen to children if parents always know best. So they don't. And when it comes to education in particular, they often don't. So the kids are often getting a substandard education.
Mm.
Not always. Sometimes they get fantastic
Right.
education. Now the kids homeschooled to get fantastic educations
Right.
because they've got these genius parents and things who school them, but most aren't like that. And then there are occasions when homeschooling is used as a cover for all sorts of unpleasant abuse or sort of
Mm-hmm.
religious indoctrination, and
Yeah.
you know there are things that go on, and as in the US as well, people are worried that it's just not regulated tightly enough because the authorities just don't have the resources to properly regulate sort of homeschool kids. It is quite similar.
My college roommate, actually, she came from New York and she was part of a homeschooling community, essentially a micro school. And that's how she got her entire education. And it truly actually changed how I perceived homeschooling, being her friend, because
Mhm.
she's super smart. I was like, oh my God, you made your own school. I didn't realize that you
Yeah.
could do that because I only knew this one random
Mhm.
kid from my town. He was the one
Yeah.
homeschooled kid in the town. And then there was a lot of athletes that would come in that were homeschooled, but there was
Mm.
only the one guy that was always by himself that would
Mm.
be on your team randomly for sport because his mom would get him into soccer or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But my roommate, she was super smart, and the ways that she would talk about her
Yeah.
education growing up, I was like, wow, this is really cool. I feel like in the US, the only standardized test that proves if you got a good education or not is how you place on the ACT and the
Yeah.
SAT. I'm not sure if that's a good.
That's right. But it makes homeschooling easier, if you
Yeah.
like. But well, it makes it easier in that respect. But I would say it would make it more difficult for the people who are actually homeschooling. At least in the UK, if you want to say, okay, I'm going to school my kids myself, then you have ready-made sort of
Hmm.
curricula and learning materials that you need. You know exactly what you need to teach them to pass these particular exams in all the different subjects. So even though that's probably a little bit constraining, at least you know what maths they need to know at a particular
Right.
age. You can sort of follow it through. Whereas if you're homeschooling in the US, it must be difficult to know. What do my kids have to know? What should they know? Oh,
We had the CSAP when I was growing up. I'm not sure if they still have it, but it was a standardized test that we had to take every year. So I wonder if there is something like that. I honestly haven't looked into it because my dog doesn't need to go to
all right.
homeschooling. So
That's good. That's good. That's good. But what history should you teach them?
yeah,
What geography should you teach them?
right.
What science do they need to know? There's all the different subjects, all the different things, and you get to choose, don't you? If you're homeschooling and what you teach them.
Yeah.
What about if you teach them the wrong stuff and then all of a sudden they can't get a job? Or
Yeah.
I mean, the social aspect's very, very important
Hmm.
if they're not able to function with other people, and that's going to be a problem for them.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because this became a big thing during the pandemic. And a lot of the
Yeah.
time we're talking about these kind of pandemic kids now because a lot of
Mm.
these kids are 5, they're more in our
Yeah.
society than just little babies. So let's kind of get into it. What
Yeah.
is microschooling and what are we actually talking about here of this thing that was on the rise during the pandemic?
Yeah, it was. Right, so you can think about microschools as a modern reboot of the one-room schoolhouse. So very, very sort of traditional Little House on the Prairie view of American schooling, which actually is quite a remarkable success story of early United States. The fact that all these people scattered about this huge country managed to get a pretty good education through these sort of schoolhouse systems. So instead of having hundreds of kids moving through these standardized lessons in a very big building, a micro school or one of these learning pods is 5 to 15 students meeting in a home or community space. So they might have a teacher, a qualified teacher, or parents might rotate teaching duties, or maybe one parent will take on all of the duties. There's various different ways of organizing it. So micro schools really exploded during the pandemic when families were desperate for alternatives, but a lot of these setups stuck around afterwards. So for some parents, it's gone from this emergency model just to get their kids to have some kind of education to actually the preferred model.
Okay. And supporters make it sound like it's kind of the future of education, right? It's personalized, it's
Mhm.
nimble. You obviously have a much higher investment in your own kids' education than
Mhm.
maybe a professional might in a room of 25 kids. It's also
Yeah.
community driven. So critics also have something to say here, which is
Mhm.
essentially wait a second, what about oversight, quality assurance, and funding?
Yes, exactly. So on one side, you've got advocates like the State Policy Network who say microschools empower families, keep the kids engaged, and shouldn't be strangled with red tape. But on the other side, you've got skeptics warning about these inequities that can slip in, the lack of accountability of the quality of the teacher or what's being taught, and the risk that they siphon resources away from traditional schools. So it's just another version of this classic American education debate, which is freedom and choice versus accountability.
Right. And privilege is definitely here in the conversation.
Ah,
And, what's the cost for humanity for the privilege of a few? Congress hasn't
well,
really
that's right.
touched this.
No, no, they haven't. So at the federal level, there's nothing that directly addresses microschools, at least not yet. There are some sort of tangential propositions like expanding 529 accounts, a lot of voucher style programs. The Big Beautiful Bill had a lot of this stuff in it. So vouchers are becoming much, much more widespread now. And this could indirectly benefit microschools. But
Okay.
Washington has pretty much stayed hands off on this. It's the states that are writing the rules, or in some case, erasing the rules.
Okay, well, then let's walk through a legislative timeline. How did states start dealing with this?
Well, so in the early pandemic years, so I think way back to 2020 and 2021, seems like a long time ago, lawmakers were really just trying to make sure that parents weren't breaking the law by gathering their kids together. So
Mm,
you had, for example, like Connecticut's HB 6138, Colorado's SB 71, which were both about clarifying the legality of pods within homeschool frameworks and basically making sure that people who were doing this weren't breaking the law. Neither of the bills passed, but they did mark the what even is this thing phase.
okay, so first it was are pods legal? then it becomes, how do we fund them?
Yes, exactly. So from 2021 onwards, funding did come into play in the bills that were introduced. So Arizona's HB 2853 is the headline one. It expanded their empowerment scholarship accounts to all students, basically creating a universal voucher scheme that microschools could also tap into. West Virginia's HB 2013 created one of the broadest educational savings accounts in the country, which is also explicitly usable for pods. And then you've got Arkansas's HB 1464 that opened eligibility for state scholarships to microschool families. These all passed and became models for other states. So what you've now got in these states is that these crucial elements that public taxpayer funded education money can be used for people to educate using these sort of micro schools.
And that is an aspect of vouchers. And I know we've talked about vouchers in the past, but could you give our listeners just a quick overview of what that is, just in case they don't know?
So sure, yeah. So we have spoken about this quite a lot. It's been a real hot button issue across a lot of states. There was a massive battle in Texas for many years over this, which finally been resolved, and they passed the scheme. So effectively, a voucher system says, okay, we're going to take the money that the state would spend on your child's education in the state system. We're going to give it to the parent. The parent can then spend that money within certain constraints on things like buying educational resources, on sort of homeschooling costs, or even on sending their children to a private school. So that they started as a way of funding children with very special needs, very specific needs, children with sort of severe disabilities and things who really struggled in state schools. So therefore, the parents who in those situations genuinely do know best can then say, look around, find the best school for their child, and actually use that state money to actually go and pay for that. But they were very quickly expanded out so that now they're used very often for parents who are just not happy with their local state schools. They want to send them to a better school. Perhaps in a lot of cases, this is like religiously oriented. So perhaps they want their child to get a more sort of rigorous religious education in one way or another. And this can happen in a lot of states. Now, the worry, of course, is that you are sucking money out of already underfunded school systems and often passing it along to parents who, let's face it, could probably afford to pay for private education for their children anyway. So why is taxpayer money being used to subsidize well-heeled parents so that they don't have to pay for the private education of their children? Now, it's not in all cases, and data can often be sort of quite sparse on this because you'll often find that a lot of these schemes, they don't also include a lot of monitoring and data capturing in there. So it's quite often hard to find the actual facts here. But where there have been studies done, they have shown that a lot of this money tends to be going to sort of private schools.
One of my friends was actually a COVID pod teacher up in the mountains for a very rich Mormon family. And I'm wondering, did they get a voucher? But, who knows? So, okay, back to the legislation. What about Florida? I've seen that they've been in the headlines a lot with a lot of focus on school choice.
Yes, unsurprisingly, this push for school choice tends to be very much a red state thing. It was a big part in Project 2025 that we've spoken about a lot as well. But Florida did actually have a full start when it was talking about micro schools. So H1325 would have created a neighborhood pod program, but it died in committee. Then 2 years later, they went big with HB1, which was a broad school choice expansion that effectively opened funding channels that micro schools could use. So they ended up in the same place, but just without a pod specific law.
Okay. And meanwhile, some states weren't rushing to throw money at this pod idea. What did regulation-focused states do?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? So they tend to be blue states, and the blue state approach has been much more cautious to microschooling, just as they tend to be very skeptical about voucher schemes in general. So in New York, you have bills like A9202, A2265, which would fold microschools into existing private school compliance rules. So that means a lot more paperwork, a lot more oversight, but not an actual outright ban on them. Massachusetts had H593, which has a very similar flavor, but that one's stalled. Illinois has really leaned into the oversight too, with bills like HB 3398, HB 4765, HB 3544, and so on. So think tax credits and oversight boards rather than just open-ending funding that you get in other states.
Okay, and then there's also Alabama here in the mix, and they tried to write legal certainty into law?
Yes, that's right. You had Alabama's True School Choice for Alabama Act in 2024, which was designed to protect microschools explicitly, and that one stalled. But then the state passed the Choose Act, a broad
Hmm.
school choice program that proved so popular that the legislature actually boosted its budget by $80 million in the first year. So it
Wow.
had a total of 180 million. It was just so massively oversubscribed. So proved very, very popular for the state. And micro schools do benefit indirectly from that expansion.
Okay. And then we obviously have Texas still in the mix here.
Absolutely.
And they
Absolutely.
went big, right?
They did. So all this was tied up with last year when they ended up, how many they had about 20 different special sessions or something. They had loads of special sessions,
Yeah.
all with Greg Abbott trying to pass school choice legislation and failing, basically because the Republicans in Texas were very suspicious about school choice programs. They thought that it would mean funding being drawn away from rural schools, and rural schools in
Mhm.
Texas very much the sort of the center of the community. So they didn't want to see them being weakened. So they're very suspicious. But they did pass SB 1955. Now this exempted learning pods from childcare and facility rules, which meant that they wouldn't be regulated like daycare. So a sort of really good, really important deregulatory measure there for Texas. And since then, micro schools have been wrapped into these larger school choice pushes. So back in 2023, during the HB1 special session, you had HB 100 and SB 8 and various others. And as we say, these really struggled to pass. But the momentum is clear here. Texas really wants these pods and this small scale schooling to actually be rolled into their whole push for school choice.
Okay, all right. So in red states, micro schools are being funded, kind of like mainstream school choice, which we're hearing a lot about.
Mhm.
In blue states, they're being regulated and limited.
Yes, that's right. So
Okay.
it's a patchwork, and without the federal framework, a microschool in Arizona could look very different from a microschool in Massachusetts.
Hmm.
The Microschooling Center projects another million students could join microschools by 2027. So that really means that these legislators are going to have to stop treating pods like a sort of a quirky boutique experiment and actually start writing real rules that balance this innovation with proper accountability.
All right. Well, that kind of means the big question is whether the future looks more like Arizona's laissez faire universal voucher model or New York's you can do it, but we want guarantees you'll do it right.
Yes, that's right. And that is the tension. Micro schools may be small, but the policy questions around them are anything but.
And that is why we're here to read beyond these bill numbers so you don't have to.
That's it. That's right. So that's it for today. Don't forget to read the blog on BillTrap50.com and like, subscribe, and share this episode. And until next time.